So in this screencast, we are going to continue our journey through the digestive system. So this gentleman took a bite out of the apple or whatever. In my example, we're doing a ham butter sandwich. But whatever it is, he took a bite and the teeth mechanically chewed it up in the mouth. The salivary glands added some enzymes that help begin the digestion of carbohydrates. He then swallowed that food down the esophagus. We are now in the stomach. So the stomach is this kind of J-shaped organ right here. And I want you to think to that Spogel activity you did. Which part of the sandwich is digested in the stomach? And I'm hoping you said protein. And you are correct if you said protein. So before we get into the function of the stomach, let's just look at the anatomy. Like I said, it has this kind of J-shaped structure, and you'll notice that the top and bottom have these circular openings called sphincters. And the lower esophageal sphincter is that gap between the esophagus and the stomach, while the pyloric sphincter is the gap between the stomach and beginning of the small intestine. The first major function of the stomach is that it stores food. Lining the wall of the stomach are these little bumps. They're called rugae, and they're actually folds, and they allow the stomach to expand. So when the person is hungry, you're going to see these rugae be very highly defined like they are now. But when they're full, then the food allows these rugae to kind of flatten out, and the wall would be a nice smooth lining. So the stomach literally can expand to accommodate more food by simply unfolding these rugae and kind of pressing them outward. This is why after a big meal, you got that kind of food baby thing going. You're like, oh man, and your stomach, it feels bigger. And that's because it is bigger. It is expanded. Note, I'm pretty sure this woman's pregnant. I couldn't find like big belly. I don't know, it didn't work. So, the other function of the stomach is that it continues digestion. Again, mostly of which molecule? Hopefully you said protein. It does this in two ways. There's mechanical digestion, where the muscles of the stomach, you can see these muscle fiber lines pointing in kind of opposite directions, right angles, and then a diagonal here. These muscles sort of churn the stomach to help mix the bolus and turn it into this kind of semi-liquidy material, very disgusting. But then there's a chemical digestion process. Now, in order to chop proteins up, there's an enzyme called pepsin. And pepsin's job is to chop the proteins down into amino acids, which are the building blocks. Pepsin, by the way, is released simply by cells that line the stomach here. Now, you may be familiar with the fact that the stomach is acidic, and you may wonder, well, what's the point of the acid then? If there's an enzyme, pepsin, breaking up the food, what's the purpose of the acid? Well, the acid, maybe you remember this from biology class, but proteins have a very specific three-dimensional shape that lets them do their job. Now imagine I gave you a strip of paper, and that strip of paper represented a sequence of amino acids, but then I kind of folded that paper up into a little blob. And then I said, okay, cut out those individual amino acids. Well, you couldn't do it if the piece of paper is in a blob. You need to kind of unfold the paper so you can go cut, 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 cut. The acid does that. The fancy word for this is we say that the acid denatures the protein. It kind of unfolds the protein. That big coiled three-dimensional shape is kind of uncoiled and makes this little messy tangle. And then the enzyme pepsin is able to come in and chop it up. So to summarize, the enzyme pepsin breaks proteins down into the amino acids, and then the acid denatures or unfolds the proteins so that the pepsin can actually access them and do their job. So the stomach is all about storing the food, and it starts the digestion of proteins. And that storing is important because you need energy 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And so by storing food and having the capacity to do that, it means you don't need to eat constantly. You can just eat a bunch, store it in your stomach, and then little bits of nutrition continue on throughout the day. And it saves you having to eat constantly, which is kind of nice. One final thing is that the stomach does have a mucus lining to protect itself from the acid. That acid is a very strong acid, has a low pH, pH of 2, and so that will cause damage. And so this mucus layer is continually produced and destroyed by that acid. In fact, 500,000 cells in the stomach lining are replaced every minute, and the whole lining is replaced every 3 days. So that acid is not to be messed with, but luckily that mucus layer is up to the task. One more function of the stomach, microorganisms in your food are oftentimes killed when they hit that acid. Just like the acid denatures enzymes and unfolds proteins, they also can kill, it also can kill microorganisms most of the time. So that's another function. So problems with the stomach. Well, maybe you've heard of a couple of these. Acid reflux, more commonly known as heartburn. What's happening here is acid from the stomach is able to pass through that lower esophageal sphincter and move into the esophagus. Now, the stomach has that mucus lining to protect itself from acid. The esophagus does not. And so if that little sphincter, that little circular muscle between the esophagus and stomach isn't working properly, acid can creep up the esophagus and then cause pain. It's called heartburn because the esophagus goes right behind your heart. And so you kind of feel it where your heart is, but it has nothing to do with your heart. Bulimics, by the way, bulimia is an eating disorder where people eat a lot and then they vomit it up later. They can often have damage to their esophagus from throwing up so often due to the acid. Their teeth also can erode from the acid too. Another problem you hear about related to the stomach is an ulcer, and that's a sore in the lining of the stomach, and it's caused by bacteria that damage the cells that produce that mucus lining. And so without that mucus lining, the acid damages the stomach and can cause problems. The next structure that the food passes through, so mouth, down the esophagus, through the stomach, the next one is the small intestine. Which part of the sandwich is digested in the small intestine from your Spogel? Do you remember? Hopefully you said all three: carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. So before we get into that, there's three main parts to the small intestine. The first part is the duodenum. Sometimes it's called the duodenum, the duodenum, lots of ways to pronounce this. That's about your first foot or so of this. Then the jejunum and the ileum come next, and there's really not a huge structural distinction between these two. So the physiology, in the duodenum, this is where digestion completes. So there's a couple ways this happens. First, there's a mechanical digestion where the wall of the small intestine kind of squishes the food in there, kind of and that breaks the food into smaller pieces. And then there's a chemical digestion. There are enzymes in the small intestine that break down all three of the major components of food: carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids. So pretty much all digestion happens in the small intestine. We tend to think of the stomach as the major thing doing digestion, but in reality, the small intestine is the real powerhouse, and that first foot, really, of small intestine. And what's even more amazing is that throughout the collective action of all of this, we are literally breaking our food down to these individual molecules that make it up, which is pretty crazy. So how does it pull it off? Well, it doesn't do it alone. The small intestine gets help from accessory organs. Remember, accessory organs help digestion, but food does not pass through them. So first off is the pancreas. This is the pancreas right here. And you can see that there's cells, if we zoom in on it, these cells produce digestive enzymes. And these digestive enzymes are released into this duct, and they travel down the duct, and they are dumped into the small intestine. So all those enzymes that help break down the food actually come from the pancreas. So the pancreas is pretty important. You may have heard of the pancreas as playing a role in managing blood glucose levels, and it does that too. These purple cells here are cells that produce the hormones insulin and glucagon. So we're not going to get into that because that's an endocrine system function, and we're kind of focused on digestion right now, but that's where that's happening also in the pancreas. So the pancreas releases digestive enzymes, and it releases a base to neutralize the acid from the stomach. So you may remember that the contents of the stomach pass through this pyloric sphincter into the small intestine. Well, when that happens, acid is also passing through. So by releasing a base, the pancreas is able to neutralize that acid because acid plus base forms water, and that's why the small intestine is not damaged by that acid. If this function isn't working properly, you can get an ulcer in that small intestine. That happens sometimes. The liver is next. The liver is the largest internal organ in the body. You may remember that the skin is the largest organ overall, but inside the body, the liver is the biggest one. And it does a ton of just kind of biochemically kind of technical stuff. It's hard to explain to a first grader what the liver does because it's kind of complex. But one of the main things it does is it produces something called bile. Bile has this chemical structure, and it helps dissolve fats in a water-based digestive fluid. So what does that mean? Well, maybe in chemistry or somewhere you've seen oil and water mixed together. If you mix oil and water, they will separate. They don't mix. And if you swirl that little test tube around to try and mix them, they'll separate themselves out again. It doesn't work. Well, what you can do is you can add what's called an emulsifier to the oil and water. Soap is an example of an emulsifier, and so is bile. The bile has two components. There's a little portion of the molecule that interacts with the water, and then there's a portion that interacts with the fat. And so in doing this, it can kind of interact with the fat, but also break it apart so that the little fat droplets can be dissolved in water. And so when you mix bile in here, the oil and water do in fact mix together. So in order to digest fat, the enzymes are in the liquidy part, the water-based part. And so in order to digest the fat, you need to mix these together, and bile does that. The liver has a lot of other functions too. You can kind of read this screen, but here's a couple of them. It helps regulate blood sugar. It stores vitamins. It makes some proteins. It detoxifies substances in the blood. Alcohol and prescription drugs are both detoxified in the liver, and you may think, wait, a prescription drug? That's not a toxin. But your body doesn't know that. It just sees it as a foreign thing that doesn't belong, and so eventually a prescription drug will be broken down by the body, and that's why you have to take additional pills each day when you need that medication. Some problems with the liver. You may have heard of cirrhosis. That's basically a scarring of the liver, and extreme alcoholism can cause this. This is a very damaged liver right here. Hepatitis B or C, which is a virus, can also do this. Basically, the cells start to die, and then there's scarring that's associated with it, and then the liver starts to stop functioning. If that happens, one of the best ways to deal with it is a liver transplant. And what's cool about a liver transplant is you actually take, you only have one liver. And so a donor will actually only donate a portion of the liver. They cut out this little part, put that into a new person, and then it will actually grow and regenerate a full liver, and this person's other half will regrow and regenerate a full liver. So the liver is one of the few organs that can kind of regenerate itself, and so that's kind of cool about liver transplants. Another problem with the liver is jaundice. Jaundice happens when red blood cells aren't properly broken down. And so a liver pigment called bilirubin accumulates in the body, and that bilirubin is kind of a yellowish color. And so people with cirrhosis or hepatitis may have yellow eyes from this. Some babies are born jaundice. I was a jaundice baby. As a baby, it's generally not a major problem. It just means the liver hasn't fully finished developing yet, but generally it does, and then all is well. The final accessory organ here is the gallbladder. The gallbladder actually works with the liver. It's tucked underneath the liver. It's this green thing, and it stores the bile produced by the liver and releases it into the small intestine. So the gallbladder and liver work together to help get the bile in the small intestine to help digest fats. Quick problem with the gallbladder, gallstones. Ooh. So when cholesterol and bile gets too concentrated, it comes out of solution and can crystallize, and oftentimes they'll actually have to remove the gallbladder. Turns out that's not a major problem. The gallbladder is not hugely essential, and so it's possible to live a very happy, healthy life without a gallbladder. So that then brings us back to the small intestine, and all those accessory organs dump materials in. So in our next screencast, we will pick up from there.